Between the howling winds of a Montana blizzard, a rugged cowboy named Jace Callahan pulled a stranger from certain death, only to discover she carried not just her own life, but a child's as well. From that single act of rescue, a story of love, redemption, and second chances began to unfold. What would you have done if fate placed such a secret in your hands? And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. I wish you a blessed and beautiful day. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the many heartfelt stories yet to come. The winter of 1877 in the Montana Territory was no ordinary season. It was the kind of winter that demanded blood or bone as toll for every step. The Gallatin foothills lay smothered under snow so deep that even the pines seemed bowed with exhaustion. The sky above was a sheet of pewter, the wind a knife edge, and the drifts along the old wagon road curled like waves of a frozen sea, hiding everything but their own cruelty. Jace Callahan leaned into that wind the way only a man hardened by both war and wilderness could. He was 31, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of figure that filled a doorway without meaning to. Years of ranch work had carved muscle into his frame, while a life of restraint had carved silence into his voice. His dark hair curled damp beneath the brim of a hat powdered with snow, and a scar traced like a whisper from cheekbone to ear, a souvenir of a saber fight he never spoke of. His eyes, steel blue, wary mist little, but they held a weight that spoke of nights when he had stared too long into firelight, remembering faces gone. Since the war, he had lived alone on his modest spread outside the nearest settlement, Dry Creek. In town, folks said Jace was polite but distant, helpful when asked, impossible to sway once he had drawn a line. The war had taught him command. The frontier taught him endurance. Loss had taught him silence. Beneath him moved Redwind, his chestnut Mustang. 9 winters old, coat the color of autumn maple, mane nearly black, a star-shaped patch crowning his forehead. Once wild, captured from the Pryor Mountains, Redwind had been gentled by Jace with patience instead of cruelty. He was clever enough to choose his footing before Jace asked, and stubborn enough to protest when something ahead felt wrong. In the lean years, Jace had trusted the horse's instincts as much as his own, and tonight would be no different. They were circling toward the south pasture when Jace stiffened in the saddle. At first he thought it was the wind whistling down the canyon, but then Redwind's ears snapped forward and the gelding snorted sharply. Jace pulled off a glove and raised his bare hand to stillness, letting the night speak. There, threaded into the storm's roar, a human cry, faint, breaking apart in the gale like thin glass. Redwind shifted as if urging. "All right, boy," Jace muttered, nudging him left. "Let's see who winner's caught this time." The road dissolved into white chaos, but Redwind forged ahead, snow rising to his knees. Jace hunched low, every sense taut. In war, he had learned to hear what others missed. The muffled call beneath cannon thunder, the ragged gasp amid rifle smoke. Tonight, that skill returned like an old comrade. Another cry, closer now, and the outline of a wagon, half buried and splintered, appeared in the haze. Its canvas top was shredded, flapping like a dying bird. No horses in sight, likely broken loose and gone to the wind's mercy. Jace dismounted, boots crunching deep. He tied Redwind to the broken axle, patting his warm neck, and moved forward. "Hello," his voice carried low but commanding. "Where are you?" At first silence, then a breath. "Here," from beneath the sagging canvas. Jace knelt, lifting the flap. Inside lay a woman curled against the wreckage, snow crusting her hair, her lips nearly blue. She looked young, perhaps 24, though hardship had painted its lines early. Honey blonde hair spilled damp across her face, her dress soaked through, the thin cloak on her shoulders no match for Montana's wrath. Her eyes flickered open storm gray, defiant even as they dulled with cold. One hand pressed instinctively against her middle, protective, though Jace barely noted it in that moment. "Can you move?" he asked, voice steady but urgent. She tried to rise, her chin lifting stubbornly though her body trembled, and whispered, "I don't need—" Her legs collapsed beneath the words. Jace caught her before she fell. "Easy now. You'll walk tomorrow if you're lucky. Tonight you ride." She shook her head weakly, pride sparking in her eyes, but Jace didn't waste the breath to argue. He shrugged off his heavy duster and wrapped it around her thin frame, then scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but carried a strange weight, the weight of someone who had fought too long to surrender even when strength was gone. Redwyn blew softly when Jace approached, as if sensing the urgency. Jace lifted her carefully onto the saddle, swung up behind, and drew her against his chest. One arm braced her, the other held the reins. "Home," he whispered, and Redwyn started forward, his stride deliberate, his body a shield against the storm. The ride was brutal. The wind clawed at every seam, and snow stung like ground glass. Jace's body took the punishment his coat no longer gave, but he kept his arm firm around her. He felt her shivers weaken into fitful tremors, felt her head sag against his shoulder, and once, when Redwyn stumbled then recovered, he felt her clutch at him with surprising strength. "You're safe," he murmured, unsure whether he meant it for her or for himself. After an eternity, a glow pierced the white, the lantern he had left on his cabin's porch. Relief surged like fire in his chest. The cabin itself rose, squat and sturdy, logs squared and chinked against the wind, chimney smoke nearly torn sideways. Dismounting, Jace lifted her again. Redwyn snorted and stamped, shaking ice from his mane, watching as Jace shouldered through the door. Inside, heat hit like salvation. The small fire he had banked earlier sprang back with a roar once coaxed, shadows flickering against stone walls. He laid her on his bed, the only bed, and worked quickly. Boots off, sodden dress peeled away with careful hands, replaced by one of his flannel shirts and wool socks. His jaw clenched as he hesitated. War had taught him necessity, but propriety still tugged. "Forgive me," he muttered, almost a prayer, before wrapping her in every blanket he owned. He built the fire higher, set water to boil, and rubbed warmth back into her fingers. When her breathing steadied, some color returning to her cheeks, Jace finally allowed himself a breath. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, then opened. Those storm-gray eyes studied him with weary defiance. "You saved me." Jace nodded once, resting an arm on his knee. "Anyone would have." Her lips curved faintly, bittersweet. "Not anyone." A pause, then barely a whisper. "Evelyn Hart." The name hung in the cabin's air, fragile and uncertain. "Jace Callahan," he returned. "You'll be safe here tonight." She tried to speak again, but only managed a faint murmur. It sounded almost like a name, Marlowe. Before her eyes slid shut, sleep claiming her. Jace frowned, recognizing the echo. In Dry Creek there had been whispers months ago about a family named Marlowe, tied to scandal in St. Louis. He filed the thought away. Questions could wait until morning. For now, she was alive, and that was enough. Outside, Redwyn pawed the ground once, a low rumble of vigilance before settling into the lean-to. The storm hammered at the walls, but the cabin held. Jace pulled his chair beside the bed, watching the fire's glow dance across Evelyn's face. She looked less like a stranger now, and more like a riddle. A woman who clung to life with a fierceness that stirred something long dormant in him. The war had taught him to rescue men with rifles in their hands. Tonight he had rescued someone whose only weapon was the stubborn beat of her heart. He leaned back, eyes never leaving her, listening as the fire consumed log after log. The storm would not end soon. But at least, within these four walls, winter's grasp had loosened. And somewhere, buried beneath exhaustion, Jace Callahan realized that the blizzard had delivered more than just another mouth to feed for a night. It had delivered a story not yet told, a test he hadn't expected, and a choice that would alter every tomorrow to come. Dawn came reluctantly over the Gallatin foothills, pale light filtering through a sky still burdened with snow, the storm easing but not defeated. The cabin stood stoic against the cold, its roof crusted white, smoke rising thinly from the chimney. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of pine, coffee, and wool drying near the hearth. Jace Callahan sat in his chair, boots crossed before the fire, his head tipped against the backrest after a long, half-wakeful night. He had drifted in and out of sleep, listening to every crackle of flame and every sigh from the bed where Evelyn Hart lay bundled beneath his blankets. She had muttered once in her dreams, a single word, Marlowe, and the sound had lodged in his mind like a splinter. When he rose to stir the coals, Evelyn's eyes were open, watchful, the color returning faintly to her cheeks. She tried to push herself up, stubborn in the way of someone unwilling to seem weak before a stranger, but her arms trembled under her own weight. Jace crossed quickly, steadying her without asking permission, then stepped back, giving her the space to reclaim dignity. He offered a tin cup of hot broth, and though she managed to lift it, her hand drifted almost unconsciously to her abdomen. Jace noted the motion, his gaze narrowing, but he said nothing at first. Silence stretched, broken only by the storm's distant muttering at the windows. Finally, Jace asked in a low voice if she was injured, and Evelyn shook her head, lips pressing together. The color rose faintly in her face, and for a moment it seemed she would deny him altogether. Then, with a breath that sounded like surrender, she whispered, "I carry a child." The words settled heavily in the room, and Jace leaned back, the muscles in his jaw working. He had not expected this. He had only thought to save one life, not two. Evelyn lifted her chin as though bracing for judgment, but her eyes shone with fear that he would cast her back into the storm. Jace's silence stretched long enough that she gripped the cup tighter, preparing herself. "You should have said nothing," he murmured at last. "Most men out here would see that as burden, not truth." "Most men," she answered, voice edged with defiance, "are not the kind who stopped in a blizzard." For a time they said no more. Jace poured coffee, the steam curling up like questions he had not yet asked. He could have ended it there, left her secret unchallenged, but the name she had murmured haunted him. "Last night you spoke a word," he said quietly. "Marlowe, that means something to you?" The cup trembled in Evelyn's hands, broth rippling against tin. She looked away, toward the fire, and when she spoke again her voice was brittle. "It means everything, and it explains why I can never go back east." At first she gave him little just fragments. That she had worked as a seamstress in St. Louis, that she had met a man who spoke honeyed words and made promises he had no intention of keeping. Jace did not press, though his eyes stayed steady on her face. He had learned in war that silence could draw truth more surely than interrogation. Gradually her composure cracked, and the story spilled out. His name had been Thomas Marlowe, son of a banker, handsome and smooth. He had courted her with attention she had never known, then vanished the moment she spoke of the child. Later he returned with offers of money, hush money, she called it, so she might disappear quietly. When she refused, he lured her to the bank after hours, pressing a bag of money into her hands, telling her it would help her start fresh. She had believed him, desperate to trust, and by dawn the theft was discovered. $5,000 gone, all suspicion directed at her. The law listened to Marlowe's word, not hers. Evidence was planted in her room, and whispers spread that she was nothing more than a fallen woman turned thief. She broke off then, hands trembling, her broth untouched. "So I ran," she said simply. "I took another name. I meant to reach my cousin Martha in Sacramento. She has a boarding house, promised me work, but the storm—" Her voice faltered, and her hand went again to her belly. Jace did not speak right away. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring into the flames. He could almost hear Sheriff Amos back in Dry Creek, a square-shouldered man of 50 with a habit of spitting tobacco juice between every sentence, warning him months ago that notices had come up from St. Louis for a seamstress named Winifred Gladstone accused of theft. Now he sat across from her, shivering in his coat, calling herself Evelyn Hart. "Why tell me?" he asked at last, his voice even. "I could ride to Dry Creek this very day. Sheriff Amos would clap you in irons before sundown." Evelyn flinched as if struck, and for an instant her mask of pride fell. She swung her legs from the bed, the blanket sliding off her shoulders, her eyes fierce. "Then I'll not wait for him to come. I'll go into the storm myself." She made to stand, her body swaying, but Jace was across the room in 2 strides, his hand gripping her arm with firm steadiness. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice not loud but heavy with command. "No one is sending you into that storm, and no one will drag you out of this cabin while I draw breath." For a heartbeat their eyes locked hers, flashing with defiance and fear, his hard with resolve. Slowly, reluctantly, she sank back onto the bed, her shoulders shaking, though no tears fell. The fire popped, breaking the silence. Jace released her arm, gentler now, and said, "You don't have to trust me, but you'll be safe here until you're strong enough to travel. That much I give you." Evelyn's lips parted, a whisper escaping. "Why?" Jace straightened, his gaze drawn briefly to the saber above the hearth, relic of battles fought long ago. "Because I've seen men broken by lies told by those with power, and I won't be the one to finish the breaking." She looked at him then with something softer than suspicion, though her pride kept her silent. Outside, Redwin snorted, stamping in the snow as if to mark his presence. Jace opened the door to toss out a bucket of ash, and when Evelyn followed to the threshold, wrapped in his coat, the Mustang lifted his head and stepped nearer. His breath steamed in the cold, ears flicking toward her. She reached out tentatively, and the gelding pressed his muzzle into her palm, standing as a shield against the wind. For the first time, Evelyn smiled faintly, as though the horse had accepted her where words failed. When Jace closed the door again, he saw that smile fade into something more fragile gratitude tangled with fear, and he understood that whatever she had done or not done, the storm had brought her to him for a reason. Whether Law agreed or not was a question for another day. That night, as Evelyn drifted into uneasy sleep, Jace sat again in his chair, staring into the fire. He thought of Sheriff Amos, of wanted posters, of the choice he could still make. But then his eyes strayed to the bed, where a woman and an unborn child rested safe for the moment, and he knew judgment could wait. For now, the storm outside could rage and the law could whisper. But within his cabin, the decision was already made. Evelyn Hart would not be abandoned. The fourth morning after the blizzard dawned with deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky scoured clean and sharp as glass, and the mountains along the Gallatin Range glittered white in the early sun. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney of Jace Callahan's cabin, a fragile thread of warmth against the wilderness. Inside, the small room glowed with firelight and the faint clatter of tin against iron. Evelyn Hart moved carefully about the hearth, wrapped in a flannel shirt that dwarfed her frame, her blonde hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Her cheeks were no longer colorless, but her movements carried both caution and quiet determination. Jace had risen before dawn, as he always did, tending to Redwind and checking on the cattle that had survived the storm. The Mustang met him with an impatient snort, tossing his chestnut head, the dark mane shaking frost loose into the air. Redwin had lived long enough with Jace to mirror his moods, and that morning his restless stamping seemed to echo the unease Jace himself carried. He stroked the gelding's muzzle, muttering thanks for surviving another night, before turning back toward the cabin where warmth waited, but questions remained. When he entered, Evelyn had coaxed the fire into brightness, stirring cornmeal mush with a wooden spoon she had found among his sparse supplies. She glanced up at him with a fleeting smile, grateful, but guarded. It struck him how quickly survival forced strangers into fragile rituals that mimicked home life, though this was far from any ordinary domestic scene. Jace set his hat aside, brushed snow from his coat, and for a moment the silence between them felt almost companionable. Yet beneath it all lay truths neither had spoken fully, and Jace knew it. Over breakfast, Evelyn asked about his land, 200 acres of scrub and pasture he had claimed after the war, and the herd of cattle he ran mostly alone. Jace answered with the brevity of a man unused to sharing, yet he caught her eyes fixed on him, searching, as though measuring whether this solitary rancher was safe ground for her secret. When she asked about the war, his words grew quieter, his gaze fixed on the fire as he admitted he sought silence now because he had seen enough noise, blood, and death to last him a lifetime. Evelyn's expression softened, but not with pity. Instead, there was recognition, as if she too carried wounds invisible to the world. That afternoon, when the sun rose higher, Jace saddled Redwind and rode toward the wreckage of the wagon half buried near the pines. He told Evelyn he hoped to salvage supplies. She nodded, but her face tightened, as if fear shadowed her hope. Redwind picked his way across drifts, his hooves sinking into snow that cracked like brittle glass. When Jace reached the site, he dismounted, pulling free boards and canvas stiffened by ice. Hours seemed to pass in the labor, his breath clouding thickly in the air, until his gloved hand struck something solid. A trunk, iron-cornered and weather-beaten, was wedged beneath the wreckage. Inside he found a few folded dresses, damp but intact, and beneath them a letter sealed in wax, addressed simply, to Martha. The name stirred something Evelyn's cousin in Sacramento, the lifeline she had spoken of. Jace tucked the letter carefully aside, but as he dug deeper, Redwind pawed the snow nearby, ears flicking back uneasily. Jace followed the gelding's gaze and uncovered a leather wallet half frozen in ice. He pried it open, expecting nothing more than scraps, and froze. Inside was a stack of stiff banknotes and, folded among them, a wanted poster. The sketch was crude but unmistakable. Evelyn's face, drawn under another name, Winifred Gladstone. The charge was theft, $5,000 from the First Bank of St. Louis. Jace's pulse tightened. The paper crackled in his gloved hands, a weight heavier than iron. He remembered Sheriff Amos in Dry Creek, a thick-shouldered man with gray in his beard and sharp eyes that missed little, leaning across a saloon table not 2 months ago to warn him that fugitives sometimes drifted west. There's a woman, name of Gladstone, accused of bank theft back east. If you see her face, Keller, don't let sympathy cloud your judgment. Jace had brushed it off then. Now he held the warning in his hand. For a long time he stood in the snow, red wind shifting uneasily at his side, the wilderness around him whispering with cold wind. He could take this poster straight to Dry Creek, deliver Evelyn into Amos's hands, and wash his own clean. It would be the lawful choice. Yet, as he remembered the sight of her that morning, pale fingers carefully stitching a torn seam of his shirt, her hand unconsciously resting against the curve of her belly, he knew the choice was no longer simple. The law was black and white, but the woman in his cabin was all the shades in between. At last, Jace folded the poster, slipped it inside his coat, and pushed the wallet deep beneath the snow. He swung into Redwin's saddle and rode back in silence, his jaw set against the weight of what he carried. That evening, the cabin was warm, Evelyn seated near the fire with a needle and thread, mending one of his shirts as though she had lived there longer than 3 days. Jace set the trunk at her feet, her eyes lit with sudden relief, hands trembling as she pulled out the letter. She pressed it briefly to her lips before tucking it against her heart. "My cousin's hand," she whispered. Gratitude softened her features, but Jace's face remained unreadable. He stood by the table, pulled the folded poster from his coat, and laid it down between them. Firelight flickered across the rough sketch of her face, the false name, the damning charge. Evelyn froze, needle slipping from her fingers. Her breath caught, and then she whispered, "So you know." Her voice steadied with an effort. "Will you turn me in?" Jace said nothing at first. His eyes searched hers as he weighed the question not only of her guilt, but of his own judgment. Finally he spoke, his tone low. "That depends. If you plan to lie to me again, I'll ride to Dry Creek tomorrow. But if you mean to speak plain, then you'll speak it all tonight." For a moment she sat rigid, then pushed herself unsteadily to her feet, the poster trembling in her hand. Her voice broke, fierce with pride. "Then I'll save you the trouble. I'll leave now before you sell me to Amos." She took a step toward the door, but Jace was there in 2 strides, his hand firm on her arm, not cruel but unyielding. "You won't last an hour in the passes," he said, his eyes like steel, "and I won't have your blood or your child's on my hands. Sit down." Her shoulders shook, tears threatening though she blinked them back. At last, she sagged into the chair, pressing both hands over her belly as if to shield what was most precious. Her words came halting then, but clear. She confessed to Thomas Marlowe's betrayal, the trap set in the bank, the planted evidence, the shame that drove her west. She spoke not as a woman begging mercy, but as one demanding to be heard, daring him to believe. When she finished, silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Jace leaned on the table, his face carved in shadow, the poster lying between them like a brand. At last he said quietly, "I believe you. But the danger doesn't vanish because I do. Amos has eyes in Dry Creek, and wanted posters travel faster than wagons. If someone sees you—" "Then I'll go," she whispered, her voice weary. "Not yet," Jace cut in. "The mountain passes will kill you before the law does. You'll stay until spring. We'll face what comes here." Her eyes searched his, fear warring with something softer. Gratitude flickered there, and for the first time since the storm she allowed herself to breathe. Jace stoked the fire, then glanced back at her. Redwin snorted outside, stamping against the cold, and Evelyn's lips curved in the faintest, uncertain smile. For now, the law remained distant, the storm contained outside the cabin walls. Inside, something fragile had begun to take root trust, tentative as firelight, warmth trembling against the shadows. Late winter still clung to the Gallatin Valley with an iron grip, though the sun lingered longer on the ridges and meltwater ran in thin, icy streams along the frozen ground. Days passed in a fragile rhythm at Jace Callahan's cabin, where Evelyn Hart no longer seemed only a fugitive rescued from a blizzard, but a woman who fit, however precariously, into the daily life of a solitary rancher. The uneasy trust forged during the storm had settled into a routine, yet beneath it hummed the awareness that every choice carried consequence. Food supplies had run low, forcing Jace to admit what he would rather have avoided: a trip into Dry Creek. He saddled Redwind in the brittle morning light, the Mustang stamping and tossing his dark mane as if protesting the cold, and Evelyn dressed in a plain wool dress from her trunk, altered to disguise the slight swell of her belly. Her bonnet shaded her face, her hands trembled as she adjusted the ties, but she said nothing, only followed Jace to the corral with the quiet determination of someone who knew there was no other way. The road into town was lined with snowbanks, the air sharp with the scent of thawing pine. Evelyn rode close behind Jace, her borrowed gloves gripping the reins too tightly, eyes flicking from the white hills to the horizon as though every gust of wind might carry pursuit. Redwind, sensing her unease, snorted and sidestepped, then settled once her hand brushed his warm neck. Jace glanced back at that small gesture, a reminder that the Mustang trusted her more easily than he himself could. Dry Creek was little more than a cluster of buildings hunched against the wind: the miller's general store, a blacksmith's shed with smoke trailing from its chimney, a saloon with its swinging doors closed against the cold. As they dismounted in front of the store, Harriet Miller bustled out, apron smeared with flour, cheeks ruddy from the stove. She clapped her hands together, beaming. "Well, Mr. Callahan, so this is the wife you've been hiding away," she said brightly. Evelyn stiffened. For a heartbeat, her face drained of color, and Jace felt the tension in her hand as it clutched his arm. But then she straightened her shoulders, looked Harriet in the eye, and with a voice steadier than he expected, said, "How do you do, Mrs. Miller? I fear I'm at a disadvantage. My name is Evelyn." Harriet's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "I don't recall seeing you before. Where do you come from, if you don't mind me asking?" Evelyn's pause was almost imperceptible. "Back east," she replied smoothly. "My people were from Missouri. The mountains here are new to me." Jace, watching her, felt a strange mix of pride and unease at her composure. Harriet, apparently satisfied, ushered them inside with fussing warmth. While Jace busied himself gathering flour, salt, and lamp oil, Harriet hovered near Evelyn, showing her bolts of calico and jars of preserves. She chatted of neighbors, of Reverend Pike, who was expected soon, of the coming spring thaw. Evelyn nodded politely, answering sparingly, her bonnet brim shading her eyes. Jace noted every glance, every word, aware of the risk, yet also struck by how naturally she slipped into the role thrust upon her. When they left, Harriet patted Jace's arm and whispered that she was glad he had finally found a good woman. He said nothing, but the words stayed with him as they rode back across the snow. On the trail home, silence stretched between them until Evelyn finally spoke. "You didn't correct her." Her tone was even, but her fingers twisted at her reins. Jace kept his eyes on the mountains. "Neither did you." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "A married woman draws less suspicion than a pregnant stranger traveling with a man." He nodded slowly, unable to argue, but the truth of it sat heavy in his chest. In the days that followed, the charade lingered, and with each passing hour, it became harder to tell where play acting ended and reality began. Evelyn mended his shirts, sewed curtains from old cloth, and set to planting herb cuttings in a small box near the window. Jace repaired a chair for her, sturdy enough that she could rest when fatigue overtook her, his calloused hands smoothing the wood late at night while she read softly from her Bible. When neighbors passed by on their way to Clearwater, Jace introduced her simply as his wife. She lowered her eyes but did not contradict him. One afternoon, Reverend Pike arrived on his mare, a thin man with gray hair under a battered hat, his coat patched but neatly mended. He dismounted stiffly, greeting Jace with the firm handshake of old acquaintance. His eyes, sharp despite his years, turned to Evelyn with polite curiosity. "The Lord provides, Mr. Callahan. I did not know you had taken a wife." Evelyn, standing in the doorway with the sun catching her hair, offered him coffee with a composure that belied the thudding of her heart. Jace watched her, his silence deliberate, and when Reverend Pike prayed over their table before he left, the blessing lingered like a judgment, or perhaps a benediction, binding them tighter into the role they had assumed. That evening the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Jace sat by the table sharpening his knife, the rasp of steel against stone filling the room, while Evelyn folded laundry in her lap. At last she set the cloth aside, her voice low. When Harriet called me your wife, I thought you would deny it. I expected you to. He paused, the knife still in his hand, and met her gaze. I meant to, but the word didn't feel wrong. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. And if it never becomes more than a word? Jace slid the knife into its sheath with finality. Then it is still more than either of us had before. The firelight flickered across her face, and for a moment neither spoke. Outside, the wind had risen again, rattling against the shutters, and Redwind stamped in the lean-to as though echoing the unease within. Evelyn rose restlessly and moved to the hearth, wrapping Jace's coat around her shoulders. She stared into the flames, her voice trembling. I'm not Evelyn Hart anymore. That woman died the day the storm buried me, but I cannot be Winifred Gladstone either. Not here, not with you. Her words hung heavy in the air. Jace crossed the room, standing beside her, his shadow tall against the wall. He set his hand gently over hers where it clutched the coat. Then you are Evelyn Callahan, if you'll have it, he said quietly. Her breath caught, tears slipping unheeded down her cheeks, and she nodded, the name falling into place as though it had waited all along. From that night forward, she bore it without flinching. To Harriet and Reverend Pike, to every passerby, she was Mrs. Callahan. And within the cabin, when Jace returned from the range or laid his tools aside, his voice carried a new tenderness when he spoke her name, and she answered to it without hesitation. The danger of discovery still loomed beyond the valley, the memory of the wanted poster never far from Jace's mind, but for now it receded before the stronger truth that had taken root. A man and a woman had chosen a role for survival and found in it something real, not by ceremony or vow, but by need, by trust, and by the fragile beginnings of love. The Gallatin Valley still lay beneath a heavy quilt of snow, though the days had grown longer and the light seemed to linger as if promising that spring would soon arrive. Inside Jace Callahan's cabin, warmth came not only from the fire but from the fragile rhythm that he and Evelyn had built together. It was no longer simply survival. It was a kind of partnership, tentative and unspoken, yet present in every shared meal, every glance exchanged when one of them reached for something the other already held. And yet, the truth remained that they had taken no vows, only lived under the shelter of necessity and circumstance. One evening Jace returned from the barn with the smell of hay clinging to his coat and frost whitening his beard. Evelyn was seated near the hearth, her hands busy with soft scraps of cloth. When he drew closer, he saw she was piecing together a tiny shirt, the seams neat, the size no bigger than his hand. The sight stopped him short, and for a long moment he said nothing, only stood watching her bent head, the flicker of firelight catching the strands of her golden hair. Something swelled in his chest, pressing against the weight he had carried for years, a mix of loneliness and longing he had never dared name. He cleared his throat, set aside his gloves, and lowered himself onto the chair opposite her. She looked up, startled by the gravity in his expression. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "we've been living as though fate bound us already. But I cannot keep letting others call you my wife while we stand here without a word spoken before God. I would have you truly, not in pretense, not as a convenience. I would give you my name, and I would claim your child as my own, not from pity, but from choice." His voice faltered, rough as though dragged over stone, yet every word rang with sincerity. Her sewing slipped from her hands, and for a moment she did not answer. Her gaze searched his face, wary and uncertain, the old scars of betrayal still raw. "And if this is only duty," she whispered, "if it is obligation that drives you, not affection?" Jace leaned forward, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes steady as a horseman's grip. "If it were only duty, I would not feel as though the sight of you sewing a child's shirt could bring me to my knees. If it were only obligation, I would not fear losing you more than I ever feared a bullet. Evelyn, I care for you, more than I thought I could again." Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not fall. She reached across the table, her slender fingers finding his calloused hand. "Then yes, Jace Callahan," she said softly, her voice unsteady but certain. "I will marry you." The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Jace rode into Dry Creek to speak with Reverend Pike, who welcomed him with a solemn nod. Pike was a tall man nearing 60, lean from years of travel between scattered homesteads, his hair silver under a battered hat, his eyes sharp and kind in equal measure. He listened to Jace's halting words, then clasped his hand. "A vow spoken in honesty within four walls is no less holy than one in a cathedral," he said. "We will mark the day." At Miller's General Store, Harriet Miller could not contain her delight, her plump face alight with excitement as she pressed bolts of calico into Evelyn's arms. "You'll need something proper," she insisted, ignoring Evelyn's protests. Her husband, a quiet man with spectacles perched on his nose, only chuckled and wished them well, though he muttered that it had all come about rather quickly. Evelyn caught the words, her cheeks flushing, but Jace took her hand in his and held it firm, his steady touch silencing any tremor of doubt. Evelyn spent her evenings sewing the calico into a dress, the fabric soft blue that caught the light of the flames and deepened the color of her storm-gray eyes. Harriet came to help, bustling about the cabin with pins between her lips and an endless stream of chatter. At one point she paused to smile at Evelyn's growing belly and whispered, "This child will know love. That's what matters." For the first time in many months, Evelyn laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even her. Jace, watching from the doorway, felt something tighten in his chest, a certainty that whatever storms lay ahead, he could weather them with her. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, the snow glittering under a pale sun. The small church at the edge of Dry Creek was little more than a whitewashed frame with a bell that clanged uncertainly in the wind, yet inside it was filled with warmth. Harriet and her husband stood near the front, the blacksmith and his wife lingered in the back, their two children peeking shyly from behind their skirts, and a handful of neighbors braved the cold to witness. Reverend Pike waited at the pulpit, his Bible open, his voice carrying steady through the stillness. Jace stood tall in the only suit he owned, the shoulders stretched tight across his frame, his boots polished as best they could be. His dark hair had been combed, though a stubborn lock still fell across his brow, and his jaw was freshly shaven. He looked every bit the soldier he once had been, though his eyes betrayed a nervousness no battle had ever drawn from him. When Evelyn entered, guided by Harriet's gentle hand, the small church seemed to still as if holding its breath. She wore the blue dress she had stitched with her own hands, her hair braided and pinned with a sprig of wintergreen tucked above her ear. Her face was pale but calm, her gaze fixed on Jace as though no one else in the room existed. The ceremony was simple. Reverend Pike spoke of second chances, of homes built on trust rather than wealth, of the power of choosing love when the world offered none. Jace repeated his vows, his voice low but unwavering, promising to keep her safe and to raise the child as his own. Evelyn's reply trembled, but her words did not falter. "I will be your wife, Jace Callahan, in this life and whatever lies beyond." There were no rings, only the clasp of hands and the weight of the preacher's blessing. But when Pike pronounced them husband and wife, Jace bent his head and kissed her with tenderness, the hush of the church breaking into soft applause and murmured congratulations. The Millers insisted on hosting a gathering at their home afterward, filling the air with the scent of stew and bread, their kitchen bright with laughter. Harriet bustled about, pressing food into their hands, while her husband raised a mug of cider and a toast. Yet not all voices were kind. One man at the back muttered that the match had been made in haste, his tone edged with suspicion. Evelyn heard it, her shoulders stiffening, but Jace drew her close, his hand firm at her back, and met the man's gaze with a look that brooked no challenge. The murmur died, and the warmth of the room soon reclaimed her. When they returned to the ranch that evening, the sky burned crimson at the horizon and the snow glowed blue in the twilight. Redwind waited near the corral, the Mustang's chestnut coat catching the last of the light, his breath steaming in the cold. As Evelyn reached out to stroke his muzzle, the horse lowered his head in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, as though acknowledging the new bond that had been forged. Jace helped her from the saddle, his hands lingering at her waist, and for a long moment they stood together, husband and wife, with the valley stretching wide around them. That night, in the quiet of the cabin, the fire burning low, Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, her hands resting over the life within her. Jace's arm wrapped around her, his voice steady as he whispered the words that had bound them that day. No feast, no gold ring, no grand witnesses had sealed their union, only the strength of two hearts willing to choose one another against the odds. It was enough, more than enough. The world beyond still held dangers, the shadow of her past not fully banished, but for that night there was only peace, a beginning carved out of snow and silence, a home made whole by the courage of their vows. Spring unfolded slowly across the Gallatin Valley, the snow withdrawing into shadowed ravines and the rivers rushing fast with meltwater, carrying the sound of new life into the wide silence. At the Callahan Ranch, the days lengthened into a steady rhythm, but beneath the routine of chores and quiet meals, there was a pulse of anticipation, for Evelyn's time was near, and Jace knew the cabin would soon echo with more than the crackle of fire or the creak of timbers in the wind. The evening it began, rain hammered down in torrents, lashing the roof with a force that drowned even the restless stamping of Redwind in the lean-to. Evelyn's face was pale but calm as she gripped the edge of the table, her golden hair plastered to her temples with sweat. Jace's heart lurched as he saw the unmistakable signs of labor take hold. He called for Frank, the hired hand, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with gray threaded through his beard and a steady, loyal manner that had long earned Jace's trust. Frank pulled on his oilskin and rode out into the storm, mud and rain flying as he headed for Dry Creek to fetch Harriet Miller and Reverend Pike. Hours dragged by. Jace tried to mask his fear with action-boiling water, stoking the fire, laying out linens, but his hands trembled each time Evelyn cried out. She clutched his palm with surprising strength, her storm-gray eyes locking on his as though his presence alone might anchor her through the waves of pain. He whispered what comfort he could, though each word felt feeble against the enormity of what was happening. At last the door blew open and Harriet Miller swept inside, her heavy shawl soaked, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She had the air of a general leading troops into battle, brisk and authoritative, her plump hands already arranging blankets and cloths with practiced ease. "First babies rarely rush," she declared, casting Jace a quick, reassuring glance. "But we'll see her through." Reverend Pike followed, his cloak dripping, his gaunt face softened by the warm light of the fire. He took a quiet seat near the hearth, murmuring prayers that seemed to settle the storm inside the room even as thunder rolled beyond the walls. The night stretched on into a blur of cries and whispered encouragement. Evelyn's strength began to flag, and Jace's fear clawed higher with each contraction. At one point she slumped against him, her voice hoarse. "I cannot go on." He gathered her close, his lips near her ear, his voice raw. "You are stronger than you believe, and I will not let go of you. Not now, not ever." Reverend Pike's voice joined his in a low cadence of scripture, words of grace and endurance that seemed to give Evelyn a renewed spark of will. Dawn crept gray through the windows when it happened. Evelyn bore down with one final effort, Harriet urging her on, Jace bracing her trembling body against his chest. Then came the cry, the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn, piercing the silence like a miracle. Harriet held the small, squirming bundle aloft, her eyes shining. "A boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Strong as they come." Evelyn sobbed with relief as Harriet laid the child in her arms. He was small, his dark hair damp, his eyes opening briefly with a startling gray-blue glimmer. She cradled him close, whispering through tears, "My son." Jace's hand hovered for a moment before settling gently on the tiny chest, feeling the fragile heartbeat beneath. For the briefest instant doubt flickered. Could he truly claim this child as his own, born of another man's blood? Then he remembered the long years of loneliness, the aching silence of nights broken only by memories of war, and he knew the answer. He looked into Evelyn's tear-streaked face and whispered, his voice steady at last, "He is ours." They named the boy Samuel, after Jace's grandfather, a man remembered for his steadfastness more than his wealth. Samuel thrived in those first months, his cries strong, his appetite fierce, his small fists clutching Jace's finger as if refusing to ever let go. The cabin that once felt stark and spare now rang with new sounds, soft lullabies, sudden bursts of infant laughter, the quiet hum of Evelyn's voice as she rocked him near the fire. Redwind, the chestnut Mustang, seemed to sense the change as well. No longer restless, he lingered near the cabin windows at night, his dark eyes watching as though he too had taken up the role of guardian. When Samuel's cries pierced the night, Redwind would nicker softly, pacing until silence returned. Evelyn often stroked his muzzle, whispering to him as if to another member of the family, and Jace came to believe that in some way the horse understood. In Dry Creek, acceptance came slowly. At first there were whispers when Jace and Evelyn brought Samuel into town, cautious eyes noting the sudden appearance of a wife and child. But when Jace loaned cattle to a neighbor whose herd had dwindled, when Evelyn stitched clothes for children orphaned in the last hard winter, the murmur of doubt shifted. Reverend Pike's sermon spoke of redemption and new beginnings. Harriet Miller championed Evelyn with fierce loyalty, and little by little, Dry Creek opened its arms. Years slipped forward like water over stone. Clara was born 2 years later, a girl with hair the color of her mother's and her father's steady gaze, followed by Daniel, who arrived with lungs strong enough to shake the rafters and a mischievous spark that kept every hand on the ranch alert. With each child, the cabin grew more crowded, but also more alive. Samuel, tall and confident, rode at Jace's side by the time he was 6, perched atop Redwin's broad back as his father's hands steadied the reins. Evelyn watched from the porch, Clara in her lap and Daniel tugging at her skirts, her smile touched by a peace she had once thought forever beyond her reach. The ranch itself prospered, not through sudden fortune, but through steady labor and honesty. Jace's reputation as a fair man grew, his word considered as binding as any contract. Evelyn became the quiet heart of the community, her presence at births, funerals, and harvest gatherings a reminder of the strength that comes from survival and grace. The Callahan name, once only Jace's, now stood for a family whose roots had taken deep hold in the valley. On a winter night many years later, long after the first storm that had brought them together, Jace and Evelyn sat on the porch of a larger home built by their own hands. The stars glittered sharp above the valley, Redwind grazed gray-muzzled in the pasture, and inside the walls their children slept, the house filled with the sounds of life well lived. Evelyn leaned against Jace's shoulder, her hand finding his as naturally as breath. "We have been blessed," she said quietly. Jace looked out across the land, at the home forged from hardship and love, and nodded. "We have, and I would not trade a moment of it." It was not a story of ease or fortune, but of storms endured, of choices made with courage, of love chosen again and again despite the weight of the past. In the memory of Dry Creek, the Callahans came to stand as proof that family is not bound by blood, but by devotion, and that sometimes the fiercest storms bring forth the most lasting light. The story of Jace and Evelyn reminds us that God's miracles are not always loud or sudden. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of second chances, in the warmth of a home rebuilt after sorrow, and in the cry of a child who brings hope where there was once despair. Just as the Lord turned their storm into a blessing, He can also turn our struggles into light if we open our hearts and trust His plan. In our everyday lives we may feel broken, betrayed, or forgotten, but the truth is that God never leaves us. He places people, moments, and small signs along our path to remind us that His love is greater than any storm. Hold fast to that truth, and remember that families are built not only by blood, but by grace, forgiveness, and love. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and your family with peace and strength. And if you believe in His miracles, write Amen in the comments below.